My name is David. We're going to start shortly. I just want to take a few minutes to say hi, see who we have here today, make sure everyone can hear me properly. All right, cool. Looks like audio is working well. So have you taken the Gmat before? Is this your first time? Sort of, it would be nice for me to sort of get a handle on the crowd that we have here today. Retake. And if you're taking the Gmat again, then what time? How many times have you taken it before? Twice. And everyone else, this is your first time taking the exam? You've never taken it before? All right. So welcome to the wonderful world of Gmat for those of you who have never taken it before. What we're going to go over today is good both for people who have taken the exam before and those who have not. And I think I'll just wait another minute or so before actually starting to let any potential latecomers join. And I suppose in the minute you can feel free to type into chat whatever you like. Basically, our webinar today will revolve around time management hacks, as it said in the opening email that you should have gotten. We'll first start off with a brief intro from Oren, our CEO, who will explain, I suppose, what the Gmat is in general and how we go about teaching it, which is perfect for all of you first-timers, and also important for those of you retaking the exam. It'll just be a few minutes, after which we will transition to the main portion of this webinar, which talks both about specific time management strategies and a more general strategic approach. So what does it mean to do time management on Gmat? So that's basically the plan for today for the next hour or so. And I think we are now 2 minutes past the start time by my clock. So we're going to switch over to Owen for a few minutes introduction on what is the Gmat in general and who are we, after which we will come back to me. Okay, so let's go.
Hi everybody, my name is Oren Jackman and I'm the CEO and co-founder of ExamPal. I've been in the field of test prep for the past 23 years, and before we dive into the webinar, I'd like to give you a brief introduction into what we at ExamPal can do for you. If you've already signed up, you have full access to our video lessons, and you probably know that our team is there for you to answer any questions you may have. So what is ExamPal? We start ExamPal with the understanding that students all around the world pay too much and they do it for the wrong product. But they only realize that after they complete their preparation, when it's too late. What are they missing? Do you know this feeling when someone explains something to you and you just don't get it? We all do, right? Now, imagine what it's like to prepare for admissions tests such as Gmat, GRE, or SAT. The questions in these tests can have up to 10 different possible solution strategies, and all you need to do is find the fastest one. The thing is that students all around the world are bombarded with thousands of practice questions, tips, tricks, and shticks that are there to help everybody the same way. But there's no such thing as the explanation. I've personally taught over 5,000 students over the years, and when a novice teacher comes to me and asks, say, how do you explain this question? My answer is, to whom? That's ExamPal in a nutshell. To whom? We don't just explain what makes the correct answer correct. We first ask ourselves, who are you? ExamPal does 3 things no one else does. First, it studies the way you think. Second, it studies the effectiveness of all different possible solution strategies. Your goal is to be fast and correct. If there's a faster way, we'll find it. And third, using this information, we find the best way to solve each question. The best for you. Not even private tutors do this. We're with you in each and every question, from basics to the hardest ones. When we offer you a solution strategy, we don't just guess it works. We measure everything. So, just to summarize the pain, test takers spend a lot of time and money preparing for admissions tests only to realize that courses, the brick and mortar classroom courses, are frustrating. There can be 10 different ways to solve each question. How can I find which way is best for me? Ineffective. Your biggest enemy is time. How can one-size-fits-all course tell you which way is the most effective for you to save time? And time-consuming. You're wasting too much time on thousands of questions and tips that are irrelevant to you. Shouldn't you focus only on what you need? Now, there's a far greater revolution happening here, and that's in the understanding of what preparing for these exams really means. These tests are unlike the tests you had in high school. Mastering admissions tests is not about knowledge. These tests measure a skill called cognitive flexibility, which is your ability to change your set of tools very quickly according to the changes in the data that you're getting. This is why the test has harsh time constraints, and we keep moving from algebra to geometry to word problems very quickly. So, example doesn't just provide you with the knowledge you need for the test, we train you to find the fastest way to solve each question. How do we do that? Our process starts with interactive video lessons. While you study our course studies you, and it's fun. Each topic starts with a short video teaser, usually a funny one, that will make you wait for the next lesson. As one of our students put it, I'm becoming addicted. So we start off with an introduction that gives you all the basic tools you need, whether it is formulas or the logic behind a new concept, and we move from there to the lesson, in which we demonstrate how different questions from the test can be solved using different approaches. Next, our special source, practice. Each practice session starts with a diagnostic phase. We found out that even when there are 10 ways to solve a question, they can all be divided into 3 strategies: precise, alternative, or logical. This is the PAL behind the name, exam PAL. In the diagnostic phase, we analyze how well you are using each strategy. This question, for example, can be solved logically by figuring out the ratio between the numerator and the denominator, precisely by simplifying the algebraic expression, or alternatively by using simple numbers. Only one answer can be correct, right? So in the diagnostic phase, we quickly learn what your level is in implementing each of these tools. Then comes the improvement phase, in which we focus on your level and find the best questions for you to solve in order to improve your skills. That's not just being adaptive like the test is. Simply giving you easier or harder questions won't do the trick. We find out exactly which tools work best for you and what were the reasons for your mistakes. And then comes the best part. In the optimization phase, both practice questions and solution strategies are chosen to match your own personal needs. In this example, the system found 4 solution strategies ranked in order of relevance to you. In professional terms, this is an open, semi-supervised recommendation system. In other words, this is moving from machine learning to machine teaching, from deep learning to deep teaching, scanning through the ideas of others in order to find the one that is easiest for you to understand and implement. Just to give you a broader understanding of what makes examples so special, we're the first company to utilize artificial intelligence in a new innovative approach. Artificial intelligence can be described as moving from machines that replace humans to machines that behave like humans. Well, we're in a mission to create a tool that behaves better than humans. If we want an online service to be able to teach, it must have the knowledge, wisdom, and understanding of real people. It is our over 50,000 students from 156 countries who help us teach you. Our students teach us how to teach them. And it works. The effect is amazing. Research shows that an average student using an example reaches the highest possible level within segments of just 30 questions per topic. These are some of the global awards that we won over time for education, innovation, and AI. And students love it. Example has blown my mind. It helped me improve by 180 points, etc. And last, but certainly not least, we give you a real success guarantee. 70 points in the Gmat, up to 7 points in the GRE. And I'm using the term real because we're not one of these places where improvement is measured relatively to a mock test you've done when you had no clue about anything. If you have a previous score that you're not satisfied with, an official score, we guarantee that you are going to improve it significantly. So, just to give you a quick look at some of the benefits you get with Exampel, first of all, one approach to rule them all, that's the PAL approach. Video lessons that cover everything from the basics to the hardest questions. Personalized practice using our innovative system. Tutor support around the clock. We're there 7 days a week in surprising hours. Try us. Real official Gmat mocks as part of the course, plus you get Gmat Club tests if you need more practice. Essay reviews by professional raters, a big difference for non-native English speakers. You are not just measured on the verbal section. Admissions consultancy, 60 minutes free admissions consultancy comes with any of our packages. And of course, an engaging experience that will keep you studying for hours. So now for today's webinar, and we're looking forward to having you on board. Thanks.
All right. So we're just about to get started. So for all of those who joined a little bit later, my name is David. I'm a senior tutor at Exampel. What we just heard is basically an intro to what is the Gmat and how you should study for the Gmat and our philosophy in general. And before we just jump into everything else, I've sort of summarized the main points of the past 9 minutes, and I just want to give a few minutes to see if anyone has any questions about them. I already have one question on chat I'm answering, and we're going to take a minute or two to answer any other general questions about the Gmat, and then we'll jump right into the main portion of this webinar. So just to make sure, everyone can hear me, right? Cool. Does anyone have any specific questions about the general philosophy of the Gmat or how we go about it? All right. If not, then we're just gonna go straight away into time management hacks. So, in my experience, and in our experience in general, students usually go through a few phases when studying for the Gmat. And the first of these phases, as you can imagine, is basically about understanding the material. about learning the material for the first time around. And this is sort of characterized by the question of, I just don't get it. I don't get this remainder stuff. I haven't done math since high school. I'm not a native English speaker. Every student has their own unique problems relating to different parts of the material. And this is the very first steps, like the baby steps on the way to studying for the GMAT. And sort of once you've gone past this stage, once you sort of know the basic rules and the materials, then often the stage that you encounter is the applying the material stage. And this is sort of characterized by the question of, okay, so I mean, I understand what you've been explaining to me, at least I think I do, about remainders or about, oh, I don't know, geometry, or about how to break critical reasoning down into a critical reasoning question down into its logical parts, or how to understand a passage or the different types of questions. I understand all this stuff, but then I sort of look at the question and I just don't get it. I don't get why this answer is wrong. I don't get how I'm supposed to approach that question. I don't get how on earth I'm supposed to translate this 3-sentence to 4-sentence word problem into something that I can apply all the material to. And this is sort of the second stage of the material, second stage of studying for the GMAT. And these two parts together form pretty much the entirety of your first steps on the way to the GMAT. So this is what you're going to be focusing the majority of your time on for the first few weeks. And for some people, it can take more than a few weeks. So some people, once they pass these two stages, or somewhere along the middle of them, they realize that they've sort of hit a wall. They've hit like a glass ceiling, and a glass ceiling in terms of score. So it's going to be different for different people. So some people just can't seem to break the 700 barrier. Some people can't break the 600 barrier. Some people can't break the 500 barrier. It really depends on how you are with the basic material and your general aptitude for the verbal and quant material. And breaking this wall is often about two things. The first of these is silly mistakes, and honestly, this is the most annoying for a student to deal with, and it's also a little bit annoying for me as a teacher also, because a lot of these silly mistakes revolve around your personal focus during the exam. And just to clarify what silly mistakes are, these aren't just calculation errors. These aren't just I forgot a plus or I forgot a minus. These are also mistakes of the sort where you didn't read the question properly. So for example, in critical reasoning, you were asked to strengthen a certain logical claim and you picked the answer which weakened it. Or the question asked you about positive integers and you gave an answer there that related to any number and not just an integer in particular. And there are enormous quantities of these mistakes. So I have no idea, but I've had a lot of students who over time have looked at a question and have said, listen, David, I know how to solve this question, and I have no idea why I got it wrong on the exam. And sort of one of the easiest benchmarks for these types of mistakes is to sort of take a practice exam, and you shouldn't do this at the start, but you should consider doing this when you're sort of along the road in your studies, is taking a practice exam without any time limits at all. Just no time limits, just take a practice exam, and your goal is to try and get as many questions right as possible. And students often see that when they do this, their score jumps by quite a large number of points. And if that happens to you, then there's a very good chance that you know the material, you have definitely passed the first two stages, and you're stuck either on the silly mistakes section or on the main stage or of this webinar, what we're going to talk about today, which is timing. Which is students who say, okay, I get everything, I have focus, I know how to deal with everything, I just don't have enough time. And I don't have enough time can express itself in several ways. So one of the common ways, especially when starting out, is saying, I just can't reach the end of the exam. So if there's a 36 questions in the verbal section, then I only get up to question 30, and then I run out of time, and what should I do? And we're soon going to talk about that. But moving along, most people don't actually pause at that specific stage. They learn how to manage their time so they get to the end of the exam. But then they just don't have time to answer all of the questions. And unfortunately, there's no super magic sauce for that. There's no silver bullet for making sure that you have enough time for every single one of the questions. But there is a way to make sure that you manage your time optimally. So you spend time where you should be spending it, and you don't spend time where you shouldn't be spending it. Um, and and this is really what the core of the webinar is about. It's about knowing how to invest your time, and you really should think of it as an investment. So I don't remember if Owen mentioned this before, but the hardest part of the GMAT isn't actually the material. It isn't actually the questions. The GMAT says this over and over again. It says that the questions are based on high school level material, essentially. And what the test examines is your critical reasoning ability, your logical abilities, your quantitative reasoning abilities. And all of you can do this, but some of you might need more time. And so that is what we are going to focus on today. And so maybe before starting, I'm going to use the chat as a little bit of an internal survey throughout this webinar. So how many of you have actual timing problems on your GMAT? Or for those of you who have not taken the GMAT before, then how many of you feel that you have timing problems on, I don't know, other standardized tests you've taken before, SATs, college exams, that sort of thing? So far, all I'm seeing is quite a few I do's, which is um, certainly indicative. Timing is a big issue. So what sort of timing more in QA than VA? So I'm assuming more in quant than verbal. And do these sort of timing issues usually revolve around getting stuck in a single question? So you sort of get sucked into one question and don't notice where the time goes by? Or do they revolve around sort of not having enough time in general? What do you think? So some people are saying more in verbal, some people are listing specific sections such as sentence correction or critical reasoning. There is a person here who's saying that they got a much lower score on the real exam due to panic, and that's a really big issue. Psychology is a big issue in these exams, and it's part of time management. So we'll definitely address that going into reading, actually. So just reading the questions. We do recommend to all of our students to make daily reading a habit. So 30 minutes to 1 hour a day of high quality reading, of practicing active reading will do wonders for your GMAT overall. And there's a list on our website of recommended reading topics. General time management and verbal is an issue. Anything else? Any other sort of time management issues that are floating around out there in chat? So we have another psychology related comment. Someone who did well on practice exams, but didn't manage time properly on the quant section. Losing track of time in reading comprehension. So now we're getting sort of to a different type of comment, which is about self-management. And this really is a core of what this webinar is about. And it's also core to what ExamPal does in general. So we Owen mentioned cognitive flexibility before. And I'm also going to talk a little bit, not too much about this. But it's essentially about building your GMAT solving toolbox. So that is the set of tools that you have with which you can address different questions in different ways. And this is really what gives you the flexibility and the ability to sort of adapt yourself to changing times and changing questions and so on and so forth. Losing mental stamina and verbal. Okay, so I think I have enough sort of general input about your specific problems as audience today. And we're sort of going to go along, and I'm going to address these questions as we go along. And remember that the chat is open, so you feel free to ask questions during the webinar, and I'll address them on the fly. And before we start, I just want to say that the timing is so important that even the Gmat, and this is the company that sort of writes the Gmat, addressed them. And sort of this specific slide, we had the privilege of interviewing the Gmat a few weeks ago, and the full interview is available on YouTube. You can watch it. I just want to share one slide from that interview, and that is this slide. So what we're looking at in this slide relates back to what I talked about before. Students who just get to say question 30 or 31 out of 36, and they don't have time to finish all of the questions. So the y-axis divides students, or divides simulation exams, I'm not exactly sure where the Gmat got this data from, into three categories. And so there's the category of very high scores, so this is around 45, a scaled score of 45 on the quant-verbal section, medium scores, and lower scores. And the x-axis shows the number of questions that were not answered. So the orange lines represent exams which were finished, which is to say every single one of the questions was answered. And the yellow exams represent, the yellow lines represent exams that were not finished. So these are exams that had 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 questions left unanswered. But in both of the exams, all of the 5 questions were guessed. So the orange exams represent, the orange lines, sorry, represent exams where they either looked at students or they ran simulations who just guessed the last 1, the last 2, the last 3, the last 4, the last 5 questions. And the yellow lines represent students who did not guess those at all, who just left them blank. And there's a huge difference. So if we're looking at the top groups, so these are the high scores, then there's a difference of 3 points in the final quant score. And at these levels, this can be 10 percentiles, for those of you thinking in percentiles and not in absolute scaled score. This can be 3 points in your final score. So this is the difference between, say, a 42 to a 45. And the only thing that separates these two scores is that they actually finished the exam, which is to say they did not leave any question unanswered. And this really relates to timing, because naturally you just want to leave yourself enough time to get to that point, and you want to have an eye on the clock so that if you see that you're at the point where you only have a few minutes left, then very likely what you should do is just guess all of the remaining questions and not leave any unanswered. And on this note, I'd like to say that you actually don't want to reach this point at all. So you do not want to reach the point where you have only a few minutes to answer the last few questions on the exam, but you want to spread your time out evenly. And this is basically the first thing that we're going to talk about today. So especially again for the first timers, the big picture of the Gmat is essentially that you have 2 minutes per question in all of the section, in all of the exams, excluding sort of, integrated reasoning. And in quant, this boils down to 31 questions per section, 2 minutes per question. And in verbal, this is 36 questions per section at 1:50 per section. And this is the first basic timing strategy that you'll encounter pretty much everywhere. And that is to spread out your time. So you want to answer 5 questions in 10-minute chunks. So the way to measure this is to look at sort of your exam when you get to question 5 or 6 and say, am I at about 10 minutes in? Or you can do the inverse. You can look at your clock and you can see if you're at 10 minutes, then you should be at question 5 or 6. And at 20 minutes, you should be at question 10. And at 30 minutes, you should be at question 15, and so on. And there are slight variants. You know, some people recommend spending a few more minutes, like a little bit extra time, maybe 10 to 20% extra time on the first 5 questions, and then spreading everything out evenly. But in general, you want to spread things out evenly, and this sort of relates back to the last slide. So if we saw that just here, you can gain 3 points just by finishing the exam. And then there isn't an official slide for this, but we have run internal simulations. You can also gain points by spreading out your guesses. So the general consensus in the community and also with us is that it is a bad idea to guess several questions in a row. You should not be getting to a point where you have to guess several questions in a row. Ideally, of course, you won't guess at all. But for most of us, the reality is that we just don't have enough time to answer all of the questions properly, even with optimal time management. And then so time management sometimes becomes an issue of guessing strategies, which is to say, when should I guess? When should I give up on a question and move on? And when should I really take the time to sort of, bang my head against it until hopefully the question and not my head breaks. So the take-home message from the big picture, sort of, and this is again the timing strategy that pretty much everyone will tell you, is to sort of spread things out, and you can sort of make a little deadline table at the top right-hand corner of your notes just when you walk into the exam, so you don't have to actually remember these numbers by heart. And you can take these questions, sort of these timing issues, and you can sort of drill down into how much time should you devote to a specific question. So for example, sentence correction questions can usually be answered relatively quickly in a minute or so. Critical reasoning often takes longer, it takes say 2 minutes. Reading comprehension depends on the passage. And these types of specific question type strategies are not something we're going to talk about today, but you can certainly find information on our blogs and websites. Instead, what I want to do is I want to take a step back. And sort of I want to sort of remind everyone that the core of this webinar is based essentially on data analysis. So we're going to look at data from the tens of thousands of students. Everything is anonymized, of course. And we're going to try to ask, what can we learn from individual students' profile when they've taken the exam? From where they put in more time, and how did putting time into different places help them or not help them? And so the first graph that we're looking at right now is a histogram. So the y-axis is density, it's probability. There aren't any numbers, it just goes, because the numbers really don't matter. What matters is that the area under the curve is equal to 1. So all of the questions are here on the screen. And the x-axis is the time to answer the question. So how long different students took to answer questions. And so for example, the arrow on the screen right now shows the average time. So if you take all of the blue area and you average it out, you get to pretty much exactly 2 minutes, which is really cool in my opinion. It shows that the questions on our website are calibrated well. But what is really, really interesting to notice is that this isn't a symmetrical distribution. So it's not a normal distribution around 2 minutes, which is to say you don't take the same amount of time, or rather you don't spend the same fraction of questions on, let me show it like this. You don't spend, excuse me, you don't spend the same fraction of questions on like short answers or on long answers, to put it bluntly. So 50% of the question take you less than a minute and a half to answer on average. And so note that this is sort of to the left of the arrow. So most of the questions, if we sort of translate this from numbers into practical information, most of the questions, 1 in 2 questions, should not be taking you 2 minutes. They should be taking you a minute and a half. And a minute and a half is going to be a little bit of a magic number for us during this webinar. And a minute and a half to answer a question indicates that you basically get it. So you're looking at a question, and just by looking at a question really quickly in the first 10 to 20 seconds, you recognize what that question is asking you about. You recognize the concept. You recognize the tool that you should be using to answer that question. And because you've been practicing, then you know how to implement that tool. And sort of when you're sort of on the yellow brick road as it is, when you know exactly what to do to answer the question, you can answer it really, really quickly. And as we'll see later on, if you're in this position, there's a really good chance that you'll be able to answer the question correctly. And we can sort of zoom into the other end of the distribution. We can ask, okay, so you answer half of the questions quickly. So what fraction of the questions do you expect to take a really, really long time? And so this varies a lot more. It varies a lot more per student. Though we're not showing it here, we're just showing the general averages here. But approximately a quarter of the questions you can expect to take a while, especially if you're in, and it actually, it's not just for the high scores. So there's a nice graph that the Gmat shows also in the interview, which shows that people generally have, you can think of it as a normal distribution of scoring profiles. So basically you have the type of question that takes you 2 minutes more or less. And then there's a distribution around it of questions that take less time and more time. And this isn't by time, of course, but this is by difficulty. So it could be that, say, 500 level questions are easy for you, and 550 is sort of where you're at, and then 600 is really hard. And it could be that the 600 questions are easy for you, and 650 is where you're at, and the 700 is really hard, and so on and so forth. And so I can't say what sort of question will be difficult for everyone, but I can say that every single one of you will spend about half the time answering questions quickly, and about a quarter of the time on, or rather a quarter of the questions on questions that take longer to answer. And this is the overall picture. So you're going to have questions that you answer quickly, and you're going to have questions that you answer slowly. And we can do other types of divisions as well. We can, for example, look at questions that you answer correctly or questions that you answer incorrectly. And that's what this slide talks about. So what we did here is we basically did the exact same thing that we did in the previous slides. And sort of just to make sure, could you sort of please type into chat if you understand the histogram, if you understand what I'm showing here, the difference between taking a minute and a half to answer a question for half of your questions, as opposed to spending 2.5 minutes on only a quarter of the questions, more or less. I just want to make sure that this histogram is clear. It's a little bit of a base for what we're going to talk about later on. All right, cool. So it looks like that's good. So moving on. So there's a difference between, and this is a little bit surprising, honestly. There's a difference between questions you answer correctly and questions you answer incorrectly. And sort of the core behind this, so the core as we're going to present it throughout the webinar is do you get the question or not? So questions that you end up answering correctly, you actually spend less time on. And you can see this because the graphs are a little bit shifted. So the orange graph here is the questions, on average, of course, that students answered correctly. The blue graph is the questions that students answer incorrectly. And you can see there's a small shift. So the blue graph is a little bit to the right of the orange graph. And what this means is that it takes longer. And that's the area that we've circled around in red here. And if we sort of look at this as probability and not just as a general histogram, and this is essentially the more interesting question, right? The question that you really want to ask is sort of, if I spend a minute on a question, what's the chance that I'm going to get it right? Or if I spend 5 minutes, I don't know, I'm going to take all of the time in the world, what's the chance that I'm going to get it right? And surprisingly, this plateaus really, really quickly. So if we're going back to our sort of our magic number of 1.5 minutes, then if you manage to answer the question in a minute and a half, and about half of the questions you should be answering within a minute and a half, there's a pretty high chance that you're going to get it right. So hopefully you didn't make some sort of silly mistake or miss an important detail. But we're getting percentages of 70%, 75%. And again, currently we're talking about averages. So on average, our students who manage to answer a question within a minute and a half or so have a 75% chance of getting that question right. But once you go past 2.5 minutes, then you're pretty much coin crossing. So there's a decent chance that you've managed to narrow it down to the last two options. And especially in verbal, this is true. But you just don't know what to choose between those two. And if you're at this point, then it's a really, really good indicator that you shouldn't be wasting any more time on a question. It's a good indicator that you've missed the concept, or that you get the concept, but you've missed a small calculation trick. Maybe you didn't notice an identity such as, I don't know, a squared minus b squared equals a plus ba minus b. Maybe you didn't notice some sort of other simplification or transformation that you could have done to solve the question simply. And you're sort of trying to invent a solution for yourself on the fly. And if you're at this point, if you recognize that you're at this point, sort of you recognize that you just don't know what to do with a question, then going back to guessing strategies, this is exactly the type of question you should be guessing. This is not the type of question you want to waste your time on. And moreover, in general, the philosophy of, I just need an extra 10 to 20 seconds and I'm going to get it, doesn't really work. Which is not to say you should always guess, but it is to say that past a minute, if you don't know what you're going to do in a question, so if you've been staring at a question for 30 seconds to a minute, and you'd like to make this sort of decision time as short as possible, and you realize you don't know what to do, then you should immediately skip. If you've been solving a question, you're at the minute mark, you're at the minute and a half mark, you're nearing the 2 minutes mark, then you should be well on your way to a solution, in which case, you should finish it up. I mean, I'm not saying that at 2 minutes flat or at a minute and a half flat, you should just cut all your calculations and guess and move on. I am saying that if you know what you're doing, you should do it. And if you don't know what you're doing, you should guess. And it's interesting to sort of take a step back, and this is sort of the next sequence of slides, and ask, okay, so that's really nice and average, but is it also nice in particular? So is this also true, this pattern, for individual students? And the overall answer to that is very, very overwhelmingly guess. And so what we're looking at is a scatter plot, and this is in a distribution. I can't show you the distribution for each individual student in a graph. It's very hard. But I can show you the averages over all students. And so each individual dot on this scatter plot is a student. And again, we're comparing correct answers versus incorrect answers. And the x-axis show how much time they spent on right answers. And the y-axis how much time students spent on wrong answers. And so for example, in this little red circle here highlighted on the screen, you can see a student who spent 100 seconds on questions that that student got correct, and as opposed to 150 seconds, which is 50% more time on questions that they ended up getting incorrectly. And I should just mention, this isn't just because the questions are harder. So this is sort of normalized, if you like, for difficulty in a certain way. And just by looking at the graph, then what you can understand is that every single student above the line, so every dot above the line drawn in the middle is the y equals x line. This is like the equality line, where it takes the exact same amount of time to answer a question correctly or incorrectly. So every student above that line is a student who shows the exact same trend that we saw before. And we can quantify that as a histogram, and it's kind of crazy. 90% of the students, and this is viewed as an individual basis, so this is no longer just talking about the average student. This is every single one of you, or rather 90% of you, are going to take more time, are going to spend more time on questions that you end up getting wrong, as opposed to questions that you get right. And this is really the heart of time management. The heart of time management is understanding when you're looking at a question that you understand and have a good chance of getting right, as opposed to when you're looking at a question that you have a good chance of getting wrong. The average distance difference here is 20 seconds. But you can see that the spread is very, very large. So there are really, really quick students who answer everything in a minute and a half or two, and there's students who take longer, who are, at least in the practice stages, near to the 200 seconds, to the 2.5 to 3 minutes. And I think this is where we reach our first interim summary. And I'll get to the questions in chat in just a second. So the first interim summary, what we've been talking about so far, is that students spend more time, and this is currently just an average, this specific slide, but students on average spend more time on questions that they get wrong. And this sort of continued into our magic numbers. So if you get what a question is about, if you recognize the concept, if you know the tools to apply, if you can apply them, if you don't make anything, any sort of silly mistakes along the way, there's a really good chance that you can answer the question within a minute and a half, 2 minutes, and there's a really good chance that you're going to get that question right. So we're seeing percentages of 75 to 80%. On the other hand, if you don't know, if you find yourself just sitting there and staring at the question, then it pretty much doesn't matter. You're at the point where you should guess at the question and move on, so you can spend that time on other questions. And lastly, for this specific part, you have your own personal time. So this is why I didn't before go into how much time should I be spending on average on a sentence correction question, or critical reasoning, or rate and work, or on integers, or data sufficiency, or any specific type of question, because I can give you those numbers for averages, and again, you can find them. But it's not what you should be focusing on. What you should be focusing on is your own personal optimal time, and especially it's that sensation, it's that internal intuition for I know what I'm doing in a question, or I don't know what I'm doing in a question. And this sort of summarizes the first part of the talk, where we've gone over quite a few slides and have seen, for some people, for those of you who are used to looking at data slides, then this is maybe a breeze. For those of you not, it's maybe a little bit complicated, so we're going to take sort of a minute or two to go back to chat and see if there are any questions about what we've seen so far. So let's see. Obviously, you shouldn't be guessing many questions in a row, but what do the stats show for those that guess 3+ questions in a row? So really, so let me sort of share how we get to this, because I actually obviously don't have stats for actual GMAT answers. What we do is sort of have internal hacks of the prep exams that sort of we and others have done, which is to say I can sort of take a prep exam, and then I can sort of go through it, and I can answer questions correctly or incorrectly because I've already seen the questions before and I know the answers, or because they're relatively easy for me. And so I can sort of hack it. I can sort of see what happens if I get 3 questions wrong in a row, if I spread the guesses out. And it changes. It changes based on exactly how you do it. So is it at the start? Is it at the end? Is it overall? There's all sorts of technical details. But we are definitely seeing things that are sometimes on the order of 5 points difference in skill score, which is a ton. And again, it depends on difficulty levels. It depends on an enormous amount of things. And honestly, you shouldn't be entirely freaked out. So if you happen to have 3 questions in a row or more that you don't get, and you had to skip them all, then don't give up and go home. It depends on which section these questions are from. So the Gmat mixes the sections up. You're going to see like questions from different sections in a row, one after the other. It depends on stuff. But basically, don't do it. That's like the bottom line answer to that question is you should not be guessing a few questions in a row. Are there any other questions on what we've gone over so far? Sort of the data analysis part of this webinar. Losing track of time on I've spent on a question. Honestly, it's a really good question, and that ties into the psychology issues that we were talking a little bit about before. And so part of this is practice. So just getting used to it. And I do not recommend that you look at the clock every question. That's a bad way to do it. I do recommend that you look at the clock every few questions, sort of ballpark where you're at. And if you remember, the first timing strategy that we talked about is chunking the exam. So 5 minutes every, 5 questions every 10 minutes. It changes a little bit between quant and verbal, but that's the basic thing. And then even if you do lose track of time on one question, it's okay because you recover that time relatively quickly. You notice it relatively quickly because you're looking at the clock every 5 questions. So that's sort of the easy answer to it. That's the first answer. The second answer is a little bit harder, and it's just to really practice that. So ideally, in your error logs, and this is something that you should all be doing, whether you're first-time takers or repeat takers, you should be keeping an error log of what types of mistakes you tend to make. And one of the things that you can do, especially on practice exams, is when you just start a question, you can have like a clock behind next to you, like a digital clock, and you can just write down the minute that you started that question. So I don't know, I started this question at 3:46, and I finished it at 3:49 or something like that. And what you then do is you go over sort of a list of, say, if you're doing an entire practice section over the 30 questions or so, and you look to see if there are any questions that you really did waste a lot of time on. And sort of on our website, we also offer expert assessments and so on where you can actually see these graphs. So we sort of do the hard work for you and we tell you which questions you take more time on. But you can do this for yourself, and then you can look at those questions and you can say, well, what happened there? Was it a long word problem? Sometimes it involves checking numbers. So one of the best ways to approach a question that you don't know what to do with is what we call an alternative approach, and this is basically about using numbers. So you try out different numbers to try to get a feel for the question, and this helps you ground you in the question. Or in data sufficiency questions, for those familiar, you just try different numbers to eliminate potential answer options. And while this is a great approach, a great way to approach questions you don't know what to do with, it can really become a time sink, especially if you're not careful about it. So again, just to summarize the answer to the question, answer number one is to sort of batch out your time. So look at the clock every 5 questions or so and make sure you're on track. And answer number two is to gain an intuition for where your danger areas are. So are there specific methods that are dangerous for you to use because they're time sinks? Are there specific types of questions that are dangerous for you for whatever reason, and to notice them? Okay, so I'd like to move on to the second part, and the second part is, okay, so we've understood, like, let's just go over this slide. We've understood that there's a difference between answering correctly and incorrectly. There's a difference between questions you know what to do with and you don't know what to do with, and that you have your own personal time. And the second part is going to be a little bit more practical. Know yourself is the first practical tip, and apologies for those of you who don't like cliches, but it's actually very, very true. And this is what I suppose I've been talking about in answer to some of the previous questions on chat, which is like, you should be asking yourself a question as you're practicing. What does it feel like when I know exactly what to do? What does it feel like when I'm stuck? At what point should I give up a question and guess? And honestly, this is the number one time management tool. Personally, it's also the number one time management tool for life and not just for Gmat. So it's definitely worth developing. And the second tool, which is maybe a little bit less cliche, is to just build up your Gmat solving toolbox. And this is the cognitive flexibility that we talked about, or rather Owen talked about way at the beginning of this webinar. So build up the number of tools that you have to approach questions with. And that way, and we're going to show a few examples of this in a second. And that way you really optimize your management. So you're not only aware of where you're at personally, so am I stuck or am I not stuck, but you also know that of the, say, 2 to 3 to 4 tools that you have to solve a question, you know which one you should be choosing. And this relates to like the personal issue of which tool am I most comfortable using. It also relates a little bit, mentioning the error log that we talked about before, which types of questions give me the most difficulty. So some questions, it's likely that you're going to want to, for example, put straight into equations and not even try to comprehend them logically. And this is especially true for long word problems, for example. Other types of questions, you're probably going to want to jump straight into using numbers. Just because it's easier for you or because it's the easiest way to solve that question. And so on and so forth, and what types of mistakes do I need to be careful to avoid? And this also relates to time issues. So what types of, questions or solution approaches just take me a really long time. So let's look at an example question to sort of drive the point about cognitive flexibility home. And both of the questions we're going to look at are overall they're relatively easy, but they can be a little bit misleading in the sense that they're easy. So let's do this question together. So of the 900 guests that attended a wedding, 36% were women. If 450 men left the wedding, the woman would be what percentage of the remaining guests? And looking at this question, you might be saying, okay, I mean, what's the problem? So let's just calculate, right? So 36% of 900, that's the percentage of women. So that's 36 over 100 times 900. We can cancel out 100. We get 36 times 9. It's not the most fun of calculations, but okay. Let's make it easier. 36 times 10 minus 1, 360 minus 36. 324 went at the wedding. Great. Hopefully we're not super slow with our calculations and we got this relatively simply. And so now what? So we know that there's 324 women at the wedding, 450 men left the wedding. So that means that there's 450 guests remaining. It means that none of the women left the wedding, so we still have 324 women. So the percentage of women out of all of the guests, that is 324 over 450. Okay, great. So let's calculate that. So what do we do to calculate something like this? We need to cancel something out. Let's look for a common factor. After looking for a bit, we might recognize that 3 is a common factor. So then 3 times 108 over 3 times 150, cancel out the 3, get 108 over 50, do another cancellation, get 36 over 50, 72 over 100, 72%, answer choice D. Okay, so it's great. So technically speaking, the path we followed is to some extent a yellow brick road. We sort of looked at it, we said, okay, we know exactly what we need to do. We need to calculate 36% of 100, then we need to see how many women are left, then we need to calculate that, and then we get to our answer, and everything here works. And this is the point to mention that on the Gmat, these types of approaches will always work. So every single one of the Gmat questions is solvable. You can sort of just plug and chug, and you just usually won't have enough time to do it, as this question, for example, shows. And so the question is there a different tool? Is there a better tool with which to approach this question? And the answer is unequivocally yes. And so if we look at percentage, we take a zoom out, this is a more logical approach, to percentages and to ratios and percents in general. Then the percentage is the part over the whole. So we started out, the percentage of women is 36, that's the women over all of the guests. And then here we should pause and we should basically notice what the question is asking us and what it is telling us. It's telling us that 450 of the men left the wedding. So we now have half of the guests, right? Half of our guests left the wedding. None of the women left though. So we have the same number of women over half of the guests, which means that we have twice the percentage. And I just want to contrast these two approaches. So sort of just if we look at it visually for a second, then you're comparing this sort of massive calculations, and some of them aren't really fun, like 36 times 9, it's not the nicest calculation you have to do when you're stressed out in the exam. 324 divided by 450 is not the nicest calculation you're going to be asked to do, especially if you're stressed out during the exam. But just saying that you need to do 36 times 2 and you get to your answer, you need to double the percentage, that's the calculation you should be pretty happy to have to do. And this is the type of tool that we aim to teach you. This is the type of cognitive flexibility that you should aim to acquire when practicing. So when answering a question, you shouldn't just be asking, am I getting the answer right? You should also be asking, is there a better way to get to the answer? And this isn't something you should be doing right at the start. So we started off this presentation, this webinar, by saying that there's stages that you go through in your GMAT studies. So this stage is a relatively advanced stage. It's like a medium to advanced stage. So you already know the material. Like, I'm not going to teach you what a percentage is. You already know how to solve this type of question. And now we're sort of talking about fine tuning. We're sort of talking about, can you do it better? And this is the type of thing that you should be on the watch for. And sort of if we look at the differences in timings, then sort of on average on our site, then students who use, we call it the more precise approach, which is just the calculation-oriented approach for this question, took 2.5 minutes. It's quite a lot. And that's just because the calculations aren't the nicest calculations ever. And students who didn't took 110 seconds. And so using sort of the wrong tool in this case takes 40% more time on average for students on our website. And that is a lot. Just saving 10 to 15 seconds per question is a lot. Here you're saving like 40% if you're going up or 33% if you're going down, but you're saving 40 whole seconds. And I want to show a second question which showcases a similar case but with a different concept. And so let's go over this together. So 2 printers run simultaneously. An inkjet printer that prints at a uniform rate of 80 pages for 15 minutes, and a laser printer that prints 100 pages every 10 minutes. And the question is, how many minutes will it take for them to print 230 pages? And so the naive approach is to sort of say, well, I have 80 pages per 15 minutes, I have 100 pages per 10 minutes. Let's see how many pages I have per minute, and then I sort of do all of those calculations and I get to the answer. And there's a much better approach for this specific question. And sort of let's turn this over to chat for a moment. And I'm going to give you sort of a minute or two to think about this for yourself. And I do not want you to do what I just suggested. So do not take everything down to the how many pages per minute and then calculate. I want you to find a better way to do it. So let's see if there are any ideas. And don't give me a specific answer. I'm not going to say if the answer is A, B, C, D, or E, but I am looking for an approach, a faster way to calculate the answer in this case. And we are nearing the end of the webinar for those worrying. So I think we have like, after this example, we have another 3 to 4 slides and that's it. All right, that's perfect. So I see some of you are onto the much better tool. Okay, that's perfect. So let me go over both of the ways. And we're going to go over the, let's call it the naive way relatively quickly. So that's basically what we said, right? So the first printer has 80 pages in 15 minutes. You do a bit of math, you get to 5 1/3 pages per minute. Second printer is much easier, 10 pages per minute. Together you have 15 1/3 pages per minute. And then you get to the horrible math part, which is you need to take 230 pages divided by 15 1/3 pages per minute. You do all kinds of stuff there. And eventually you get to 15 minutes total, answer choice B. And again, this works, and plugging and chugging into equations, as you can call it, works always. It just takes a while. The shorter way relies on the understanding that what we did here is essentially we looked for a common time frame, right? We said, okay, we're going to take our common time frame to be a minute, usually because when we look at rate problems, we think about say the speed or the rate at which you do something per a unit of time. So the unit of time could be a minute, it could be an hour. If you're talking about man hours, it could be the amount of, say, work per worker. But you're always looking at 1 unit. So our natural tendency is to take things to units of 1, which is 1 minute. But there's really no need to do this. I mean, all we want is to find a common time frame to look at. And so 80 pages in 15 minutes, we're going to take it 30 minutes as a common time frame because our two printers work in batches of 15 minutes and batches of 10 minutes. 30 minutes is the least common multiple. It's a very, very easy number to use. So 80 pages in 15 minutes comes to 160 pages in 30 minutes. 100 pages in 10 minutes comes to 300 pages in 30 minutes. And so we've done a lot less work, and we figured out that we have 460 pages in 30 minutes. And now we need to get from 460 to 230, which is much, much easier than getting from 15 and a third to 230. And so we just divide by 2 to get 15 minutes to get to our answer. And again, the focus here isn't on this specific question, although this specific trick is nice to know. The focus here is on the fact that for a given question, there are several different tools. They take different amounts of time, and your focus in your Gmat studies should be on building up this toolbox and on learning how to adapt the toolbox to you. So some people will find some methods much easier than others. And again, this specifically, so especially those of you can look at the log on chat, those of you who, let's call it, recognized the shorter method took just a few seconds, much less than to say the 80 seconds that we show on average on our website. And on our website, it takes about 2 minutes to solve this if you're just doing the calculations. So there's an enormous amount of time saving going on there. And sort of this is the last data graph that we have in this webinar. And what it goes to show is that there are lots of these types of questions. And this is just a selection. This isn't all the questions on our website. But you can really, really see that this is true not just for a few examples, and it's not only true for easy or for hard questions, but you have questions that take a long time to solve that show a big difference between the fastest and the most common solution. And you have questions that take a short amount of time to solve, which show a large difference. And this is to show that the whole idea behind building your toolbox, behind building your cognitive flexibility, it's a correct one. It is what you should be focusing on. So this is the summary slide for this webinar. Point number 1, which we spend pretty much the first 2/3 or first half or so talking about, is to recognize, let's call it your optimal time for solving a question. I threw out a magic number of a minute and a half, which is based on the averages on our website. And this is basically, do you know what you're doing in a question or not? If you do, then go for it full speed. If you don't, then as early as possible, understand that you don't know what you're doing and move on. The second main tool is building up the cognitive flexibility, building up your toolbox. So how many different ways can you approach a question? In the parentheses of these, of the specific tool, is to sort of pause when you're reading a question. So sometimes, very often in fact, before jumping right into calculations, say for example with the printers example we just looked at, what you'll want to do is you'll want to pause and you want to think to yourself, what is the fastest way to reach the answer? So not what is the most immediate tool that I might think of, what is my first intuition, but and again, you don't have a lot of time to do this, but do take the 5 to 10 seconds to think of how should I go about solving this question? Which tool should I be using? And the last part sort of binds these two together, and this relates to the know yourself that we talked about before. So how are you leveraging your strengths, and how are you managing your weaknesses? So how are you avoiding falling into traps that you have a tendency to fall into? How are you avoiding time sinks? How are you avoiding bad solution methodologies? And how are you leveraging those things that you do well? So this might be using numbers or using equations or whatever it is. And